when you attack the rights of women in America, you are attacking America. All of this is at stake.
U.S. Vice President Kamala Harris there adding her voice to one of dozens of protests over the weekend right across that country. This week, the Supreme Court is expected to weigh in on a Texas court's decision that would effectively ban the drug used for medical abortions. Let's bring back the front bench panel to talk about the potential consequences of that. Sabrina Grover, Melanie Paradis, Kathleen Monk, and Laura Stone are all here. Kathleen, I'll start with you. I know this is south of the border, but often this issue plays, in a certain way in election campaigns here and otherwise. But I just want to start off on what's happening in the U.S. because, lead story on every newscast this morning that I was watching. What do you take away from
and the visuals,
what's unfolding?
Just the protests from every region of the U.S. right now that is happening. It's so interesting to watch. I think that strategically what I take away when I see what's happening down there is just how much the U.S. has changed in a year since the Supreme Court's decision on Dobbs and the overturning of Roe versus Wade, and just how much the political landscape has changed and what that means to Republicans. Basically, since the Dobbs decision roughly a year ago, in Roe versus Wade, America has gained about 10 to 15 percentage points in terms of more pro-choice. So the country has become more pro-choice. So essentially, the abortion issue is a problem for Republicans right now. They're dealing with that. And we've seen that. We saw that in the midterms last year. We saw that with the election of Governor Whitmer in Michigan. And so it's really changing the landscape. And I don't know if Republicans know how to put the genie back in the bottle. They understand that the pro-life message is one that appeals to their primary choices. So certainly with the president's in the election that's going to happen in 2024. So they're pushing that message. But for the overall election that will happen, it could be a disaster because we're seeing Democrats and other voters being catalyzed by this decision and coming out and really voting on the issue.
Well, it's interesting because Laura, we did see that initially. Certainly, there were a lot of voters who were kind of catalyzed by that. But then some of that dissipated. And why I thought it was interesting over the weekend was because it seemed to be a motivator again, right? What happened in this appeals court, the Biden government took it to the Supreme Court, and now we're awaiting that decision. Like, this has again cast some political oil into that fire.
Yeah, I mean, this to me is like a nightmare version of The Handmaid's Tale, which is already a nightmare, right? I mean, watching this kind of play out in real time, I think from a Canadian perspective, actually really hits home because this is something that, in each election, it gets brought up and everyone always, accuses the Liberals of trying to attack their political opponents on this issue. But we actually see it happening in the United States. And I think we're already seeing it translate here. We saw that video of Prime Minister Trudeau arguing with the young PPC supporter about abortion, and the Liberals have already posted that to their social media page and are passing it around. So, I mean, in a way, as Kathleen noted, it could be, I don't want to be glib, but it could be kind of a winning issue here for Biden and for the Democrats if it proves deeply unpopular. But, I think it's certainly already having an impact here in Canada, and voters are definitely watching. And I would not be surprised if we continue to see it play out in upcoming election campaigns.
Yeah, you referenced that video. That's when the Prime Minister, I think it was last week, was in Manitoba. I'll play a little bit of it, and we'll talk a bit about that.
Abortion is against Christianity, I think.
Okay. Do you think that women should have the right to choose what happens to their own bodies?
Personally, no.
No, you think you should be able to choose what happens to a woman's body?
It's always interesting when this issue, Melanie, becomes part of a campaign, either a political election campaign here or outside of a campaign, because I always feel like two things can be true. The Liberals can want to talk about this because it often works to their advantage, and the Conservatives often can play very easily into their trap and not have a cohesive response to it.
So here's the thing. Politicians in Canada hate talking about this, but they're all about to have to. If this gets worse in the United States and access to this drug becomes restricted in some areas, and it already is in some states, we're going to see a run on this drug from other sources. We've seen this in drug shortages like across the spectrum, from children's Tylenol last year to Ozempic, which is the diabetes drug that's now being used in the United States to combat obesity. We're now seeing shortages. It was actually added to the national shortage list in Canada because it's being sold across the border. If something like that starts to happen with the abortion drug, it is going to have an impact here. Absolutely. And so politicians are going to need to start talking about it because they're going to need to have a plan for how to deal with this. There's a major demand for access to this drug from Canadian sources. We're going to have to deal with that somehow. Maybe it's not providing it, maybe it is providing it, but either way, we're going to need a plan, and that's going to require conversation by our politicians. Whether they like it or not, they're going to get dragged into this.
Yeah, that's a really fair point, and they're going to have a clear answer, Sabrina.
Yeah, and I think, Vashi, at the end of the day, there are so many more issues that are at play here, and I think that one of the things we often face in Canada is a bit of a complacency on our access to abortion, right? So it is legislated in the Health Act. We have that mandated for us, but at the end of the day, there's also things like, can we actually access, can individuals who live in rural parts of this country access abortion clinics? In some places, the crisis pregnancy centers outweigh abortion clinics by 2 to 1. And so it's not just about, that ability to have an abortion when you eventually get to the clinic. It's about being able to access that easily. It's about not having to take extreme personal costs to be able to access that. It's about not being yelled at or harassed outside of a clinic, or being misinformed when you get there, or being, exposed to horrible parts of social media that tell you that the reason why you shouldn't have an abortion is because you're sleeping around. And so there's so many other things at play with respect to the complacency. And so just because we have that access doesn't mean there aren't other things that I think the government or people in leadership positions need to take care of. And one of those other things is like the comprehensive sexuality education, right? That's still not something that every Canadian has access to, and it's something that's not hugely mandated everywhere. And so what are the ways that we can make sure that women's rights are not only protected from the access side, but also that they feel safe getting an abortion, that they feel like they can reasonably access one, and that they are not concerned about their own personal rights in getting those?
Well, sometimes the debate that takes place in the U.S. is an impetus to focus a little bit more closely on some of the rhetoric here and the actual making good on that rhetoric. I think that's a good point. I have to leave our discussion there. Thanks so much, everyone. Thanks to our front bench panel, Melanie Parody, Laura Stone, Kathleen Monk, and Sabrina Grover. After a very quick break, we are back with today's takeaway. Stay right there.